For the European Union, some of these people are insufferable. You need to control yourself not to explode. But they think they know everything, you broadcast their ignorance all over the place, because this is a wrong battleground for them. We don't take kindly to arrogance. The plan will be implemented according to schedule.
This was the Ugandan president's response to the EU Parliament on the resolution to stop the construction of the crude oil pipeline from Uganda to Tanzania on grounds of climate change and human rights violation. The pipeline is expected to run from Lake Albert in Uganda to the port at Tanga in Tanzania. Now, we are not suggesting that the issues raised don't exist, but this sounds quite familiar. It is the response a lot of the fossil fuel projects in Africa are getting from the developed countries on grounds of climate change. This has gone to the extent of even discouraging multilateral institutions such as the World Bank from investing in fossil fuel projects on the continent. This is while the wealthy countries are still importing fossil fuels from Africa for their own consumption, and even investing in new projects in the continent. Such is the case in Senegal, where Germany are investing in a natural gas field to meet its consumption needs, yet Senegal are discouraged from mining the gas for the country's own use. This has made African leaders identify a hypocrisy from these countries, thus creating tension on the subject. These tensions were shown at the United Nations Climate Change Conference in Glasgow last year, when African countries said that the wealthy nations had failed to keep their promise to raise $100 million per year in climate finance. Some of the leaders identified that such countries were prioritizing their energy needs above climate change, while still trying to have Africa commit to policies that are not prioritizing their own development. Africa needs cheap energy in order to accelerate its development, especially now with the effects of climate change being heavily experienced in the continent. Drought, floods, and even cyclones are being experienced in every part of the continent, and most Africans don't have the means to deal with these situations. Approximately 600 million Africans and 10 million medium-sized enterprises lack access to electricity, and millions of households use charcoal, wood, and kerosene for cooking. Compare this to Europeans, who consume 6 times as much energy as the average African does. A fridge in the US uses almost 5 times the amount of energy an average Ethiopian consumes. That alone should emphasize on the need for Africa to explore more ways of getting energy. No country can grow out of poverty without abundant, reliable, and affordable energy. The solutions as things stand is not for Africa to rely solely on renewable energy. The continent lacks the infrastructure, and the cost for the full reliance on renewable energy is too high for most, if not all the countries in the continent. Africa should be allowed to consume the balance and the remaining carbon budget for them to attain development, which should be the top priority. Africa's global gas emission as it stands is at 3%, which includes South Africa, who are the highest emitters of global gases in the continent. If Africa, excluding North African countries and South Africa, tripled electricity consumption using natural gas overnight, the additional emissions would equal just 0.62% of total global emissions today. Most African countries are heavily reliant on off-grid sources for their electricity needs. Most of these off-grid solutions are solar panels, batteries, and at times generators. This has helped electrify the rural parts of the continent which are not connected to the national grid. But this should not be interpreted as a way for Africa to meet its energy needs. Such solutions can barely run a TV set and a few light bulbs. Most of the energy consumption in the world today is from industries, and these solutions cannot run industries as of now, which is what Africa needs. Data shows, no developed country has problems in accessing and generating energy, and for Africa to develop, this should be their main focus. Most Africans with no access to electricity don't have the luxury of thinking of renewable energy. Their main priority is for facilities such as hospitals and schools to access reliable electricity. Africa has large reserves of fossil fuels, and they should prioritize tapping into them without any interference from the wealthy nations. The global warming problems we are facing today were barely created by Africa, and they are the most affected. Nations who are the main polluters should commit to pay for the damages, but are very reluctant to be held liable for climate reparations. Coal, a fossil fuel that emits more carbon dioxide gas than any other source, was what made the wealthy nations rich. Its discovery made these countries develop at a faster rate than the rest, and most of these countries still heavily rely on coal. Africa's carbon emissions, even when prioritizing development, will not be the reason we as a world don't attain zero emissions by 2050. The wealthy countries should look within to start the change, if this goal is to be met. In the next COP27 meeting, which is being held in Egypt, African leaders should not commit to inflexible policies, which hinder their development, for monetary promises from Europe and the US. If history is any indication, renewable energy in Africa is not a priority for wealthy nations. So, the continent should look out for themselves and negotiate favorable deals for their citizens together. Projects such as the East African Crude Oil Pipeline, EACOP, in Uganda, should be allowed to progress without any interference from Europe. Africa should be allowed to find their own solutions to the energy deficiency in the continent.